remember the day you met the parents of your future spouse, or maybe you're picturing the ambush of a nervous girlfriend by an overbearing, doting Jewish mother. Whatever you may be imagining, I can assure you it was nothing like what went on in the Shapiro home that day. You might be thinking that Edith was sizing me up to see if I was good enough for her son. My clothes, my hair, my manners, my morals, my intellect, my family background, and so on. She probably was sizing me up. But it wasn't what I looked like, what my father did for a living, my religion, or whether I used the right fork that she was interested in. Oh, there was an ambush that day, all right, but it turned out to be a raucous, impassioned ranting session around the kitchen table about what was happening in Washington, in Selma, Alabama, and in Saigon. Charlie's mother wanted to know what I thought about what's going on in the world. Imagine that. In the family I grew up in, dinner table conversation consisted of, "How was your day? Please pass the potatoes." As a teenager growing up in the 60s, I had become very interested in the anti-war and civil rights movements. But in my experience, these passions belonged to the young. There was a clear generation gap imprinted on my consciousness, which Charlie's mother totally shattered. Edith Shapiro was not like any other adult I had ever met. She was against the war, she was a feminist, she was passionate about justice, and she was actively engaged in working for social change, as you've been hearing from Rabbi. My father told me that he would pull me out of college if I marched against the Vietnam War. I was afraid to tell him when Charlie and I were part of a peaceful anti-war protest in which we were arrested for civil disobedience. Charlie's mother made a donation to the Defense Fund. She was proud. All the years I have known Edith, she has never been complacent or cynical about the world as it is, but has believed in and worked toward the world as it should be. She was a role model for me when I was deciding on a career. I knew my life's work needed to be focused on making the world a better place, and I chose the path of social work that I am still on to this day. Later on, when I studied Judaism, I found that there is a Hebrew name for the value that Edith so strongly pursued. It is called Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. Right, Rabbi? I got to tell you a story. Edith's lack of complacency had its downside. She was not exactly someone I would describe as mellow. She fretted, she worried, and she griped. One day, not too long ago, she was going on about something, and Charlie struck a Zen pose and said, "Oh, you should have seen the stink eye that she gave him." Om was not her MO. I recently read a meditation on the blessing of a good Shiva by Alter Israel Shimon Foreman. At the Shiva for his mother, he remarked to an older man who had lost a teenage son in a fire not so many years before, "Death is a perverse miracle in a way. The slow shutdown of the organs in contrast to the gradual development of them in the beginning of life." The old man replied, "They are equally miraculous and equally divine, but we cry only about one, never about the other." Edith was my friend, my inspiration, and a heck of a good mother-in-law. She loved people, she loved justice, she loved sweets, she loved butter, she loved life. Life gave her a lot of lemons, and she squeezed every last one of them and made a whole lot of sweet lemonade. Words cannot express the gratitude I feel toward the woman who raised the wonderful man who became my husband and the father of our 2 sons. So I will simply thank God for her miraculous life, and I will say from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Edith. And thanks to all of you for your caring
feelings. My brother and I obviously grew up here in Wayne, unlike the rest of my family. And, if you guys can hear me, has anybody ever felt isolated, lonely, any of those feelings? Well, I felt that way growing up like we all did. And today and over the last week, thinking about my grandmother, I try to think about the perspective of her growing up in a world that literally cast her out, and then moving to a new country and having to learn a new language. She told me at her 90th birthday, I don't think it's in that little book, but she said that when they came to New York, they were looking for a job, and her stepfather was looking. Grandma, was the first person to actually get a job, some little job that they paid her a couple bucks, or whatever the equivalent was then, to deliver mail or something in the apartment complex. And that always struck me, and idealism can get, I think, a bad name because we have an idea of people who just have ideals but don't do the work. And you guys have heard some of these stories of Grandma Edith, and I always think that she had these ideals, but she did the work. She was the first person to get the job. She went to college and studied chemistry and philosophy, one of which probably just suited her thinking, but she wanted to get a chemistry degree because she knew she had to earn a living. And she went and she did the organizing and she did the work. And I think that that's something that inspires me and that I try to learn from her. I try to think, how well did I know her? She grew up in a different place than me, a different time. I saw her a couple times a year growing up because she was in New York. But that history, that story, made a big impact in my life, and it still does. And hearing these stories about her and reading her words, hearing her get off that train and teach her mom a lesson, as you heard that, and seeing the woman she became over the next 80 some years is really inspiring to me. And looking out here, and some of you knew her, many of you didn't know her for very long, but you know my family, and some of you have known me virtually my whole life. It helps me see her wonder and her optimism in the world. And if she can see optimism in the world, having to go to a different school because the Nazis basically threatened her parents because of a limerick, then I can do that too. And I think thinking back about that and soaking that up is the best thing, and what I want to remember about my grandmother. And any of you that can pick up any of that from your experience with us and her, I really thank you, and it means a lot to me that you're all here. So thank you for that.
Mom, that was really good. Nicely done. And Eric, also really good. I'm very proud of my family. But I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. It really warms my heart and my entire being that there are faces here that I don't recognize, which means that my grandma did some socializing and touched some of your hearts, or maybe it's just our family, but either way, it really does mean a lot that you're here. So thank you very much. Over the past week or so, I've been trying to think about what to say about my grandma. This is challenging for a couple of reasons. Number one, my grandma lived in New York for most of the time while I was growing up, and she wasn't really a part of my day-to-day life. But the other challenge is that she was so much a part of who I am. According to, math and science, my grandma was half of my dad, and my dad is half of me, so that makes my grandma 25% of me. Does that check out? Sure, nailed it. But it has been hard for me to think about how to talk about her so that we, all of us here in this room, can feel a communal connection as we send her into that which awaits us all. Likely everyone you've heard from or will hear from today has known her longer than I, and they're going to tell you all about her, or they have begun to. But I'm not going to tell you about my grandma. I'm going to tell you not about my grandma. There are those of us in this world who justify their inaction to the suffering of others, those who make excuses for not speaking up or for not doing anything. But that is not my grandma. She cared for her friends and family and those strangers who got a raw deal. There are those of us who keep our thoughts to ourselves, for whom calling someone out is considered conflict or expressing displeasure considered impolite. That is not my grandma. She'll tell you how she feels. Some people give up on life. My grandma was forced to leave her birthplace of Munich, Germany as a child because she was a Jew. But she came to this incredible place called America and put down roots in New York. Recently, she moved again to God's country, Wayne, America. Some people might refuse to pick up and start over again at the age of 90, but that is not my grandma. And finally, I was listening to a podcast that told me that the majority of people over the age of 65 will pass away in a hospital. And that was not my grandma. I'm proud of my grandma, who visited the hospital a few times, but spent her last moments in her own bed, in her own apartment, and she passed with dignity and comfort, for which I am exceedingly proud. Before ending, I want to share some of my grandma Edith in her own words from her memoirs. And it's just the last section of a paragraph about her life. Becoming hard of hearing and then deaf was and is the most horrendous challenge I face in my old age. I manage and have kept my sense of humor, but missing so much of what goes on around me is an ongoing challenge. The temptation is to give in and just withdraw. I have a cochlear implant, and it helps often, but not in a noisy situation or small talk back, and have learned and by ignoring the impatient and often ignorant behavior of some people. In spite of that, my life has been rewarding. Having retired and living in a senior facility, I still do a bit of advocacy for hearing loss awareness, but a greater part I spend relaxing and doing only what I want to do. Taking a writing course and a clay pottery class and continuing with the Now Book Club is enriching my life. And here's the part I want to point out. To sum it up, it has been a good life, and I have no regrets. That was my grandma.
Joan, Nate, Everett. The good news for you is that most everything I wanted to say has already been said, so I'm going to shorten what I have to say. But I will echo and repeat what my family has said. We really appreciate your attendance, your support over the years has meant a lot. Thanks to Brookdale for letting us host this here. Nathan didn't mention, but we do have a history here. Nathan went through his Eagles ceremony here. We won't count the years, how many years ago, but when Joan's father was here. So we do have a connection here. You've heard a lot about Edith, and you've heard a little bit in her own words about what gave her strength. What I want to focus on in a couple of minutes is something about that inner strength. I'll go into that in a little bit of detail, because as you heard, my mom was a good thinker, but I think, she wasn't alone. That generation had to deal with a central existential question of how to have a meaningful life with intellectual integrity. And I think you've heard she was able to accomplish that. I won't go into, the history in Germany. We've gone through that. But what the rabbi didn't mention, and maybe she didn't write about too much, but Holocaust survivors, they're happy they survived, but they have a question of, why did I survive? Why not my girlfriends who perished while I played on the streets of New York City? And there was another part of that was, yes, it could happen again. And what do I do to make my life meaningful so it won't happen again? But I think those things motivated Edith. I think Eric mentioned that she never did give up. She never became cynical. She never said, I've done enough, now it's time for me. She never said, they're all crooks in Washington, I'm going to give up on them. She was always there. If you go through her mail like I've done the last couple of days, there's a stack of requests for money from every sort of organization doing good. They don't keep sending them if you don't give them some money once in a while. So I want to just say something. We've gotten a lot of emails from friends and relatives over time. From my Uncle Marvin, which I think sums up what I got from a lot of them. For Edith, self-advantage always took a backseat to principle. Love of family and friends and her continuous efforts on behalf of the less fortunate were the hallmark of her life. With deep respect and admiration, Marvin Shapiro. Some of her interest in housing came from the civil rights movement, and I want to emphasize what Nathan might have said about, and Eric, about her moving from just complaining to action. I think what her gift was that she envisioned steps that could be done that would actually strategically improve the world and help those. So it wasn't, oh, there's discrimination. It was, if we get rid of those slums in Greenberg, they can move in better housing, build better housing. Or the thing that I think she was most proud of, she got the local town we lived in to put scatter housing, where they had low-income housing right in the middle-class community so the children could go to school in a mixed environment. So when she saw something broken, she wanted to fix it. I'm going to kind of play the rabbi here, Rabbi. She was not a practicing Jew, but both her and my father, even though they were adamantly non-religious, they would go out of their way not to be religious. They both were fiercely Jewish in their ethical responsibilities. And as the rabbi read, they never denied being Jews. I think they took Deuteronomy 16:18 very seriously. Justice, justice shall you pursue. It's an essential mission statement in life. Many of my non-observant Jewish friends have abandoned synagogue life, but they have not abandoned this calling. As was the case with my mother, they have elevated this concept to almost the sole pillar of their connection with Judaism. Another quote that I find very useful from our sages, and I think is relevant to how we work in the world, is from the wisdom of our fathers. Rabbi Tarfon used to say, "It is not for you to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it." And so that's the challenge we have as human beings, is to find that balance between, doing good and not doing good. How much good can we do? And we have to find that middle road, which I think my mother did quite well. These quotes don't really, you peel off the onion to try to get to what that essence was. And I always wonder, why my mother did all these things. It's fine to quote these things, but for 93 years, what was the kernel that kept her going? And I think Eric mentioned it. And it is something, I don't know how you instill it. I think maybe our religious leaders, might have a way. But last week while I was doing some reading, I read a column from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He used to be the chief rabbi in the United Kingdom. He's a very wise man. Everything he writes is fantastic. But he wrote towards the end of this column, and I think this is pertinent maybe more to me than anyone else, but I think it tries to get at what was her kernel. To be a Jew is to be an agent of hope in a world serially threatened by despair. Every ritual, every commandment, every syllable of the Jewish story, every element of Jewish law is a struggle against escapism, resignation, or the blind acceptance of fate. Judaism is sustained by struggle, the greatest ever known, against a world that is, in the name of the world that could be, should be, but is not yet. So to conclude, her inner strength came from the firm belief that the world is fixable, that we are all responsible for helping make things better. We don't have to finish the job, we just can't sit idly by. Edith was motivated by this faith that we can make a difference. And to me, her actions were more impressive because she did not fall back on some force that would either punish or reward her actions. She focused on this world, this life, and she was willing to let the spiritual chips fall where they may. So, Mom, I want to honor you with a prayer that expresses somehow I feel, and it gives me comfort. It's a takeoff on a prayer that the Rabbi already said, but I will bear repeating it as we close. A prayer for mourners. To us who mourn the loss of loved ones, let there come the comfort of the hope. Though the dust returns to the earth as it was, the spirit returns to the Creator who gave it. Death is not the end. Our dear ones have passed away through the gateway of the grave into the peace of life that endureth always. We know that all of us must tread the same path, though we know not when the hour may strike. Let us live that all of us must tread the same path. Let us live that the coming of the hour shall find us unafraid. May our deeds do honor to the memory of our beloved, whom has returned to the source of life. In unshaken trust in the source of all blessings, we give praise to the order of the universe.